Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling those tricky bumps in the road we all hit when learning a new language. You know those moments you wish you could just skip? But get this, turns out a lot of these common mistakes, well, they come from how we think about language learning. So we're diving into a source called 8 Common Mistakes Most Language Learners Make to figure out what's going on. And trust me, you're not alone in this. That fear of messing up pronunciation, getting tangled in grammar rules, that urge to translate everything word for word. We've all been there. So let's jump right into that first mistake the source calls out, grammar glut. It's that feeling of drowning in verb conjugations and grammar rules like you're stuck in a textbook forever.
Yeah, it's interesting how many learners get caught up in this trap. The source makes a great point comparing it to learning to dance. Imagine trying to learn to dance just by reading about it.
Hmm.
You might know the steps in theory, but can you actually move and groove? Language is all about expressing yourself, connecting with others.
So true. It's like trying to learn to swim by just reading a manual. You got to get in the water and splash around a bit, right? But how do you find that balance between hitting the books and actually using the language?
Well, the key is to remember that grammar is a tool, not the whole toolbox. You need some grammar, for sure. But don't let it become a roadblock that stops you from actually using the language. Think of it like learning to drive. You need to know the rules of the road, but you also need to get behind the wheel and practice.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about finding that sweet spot between theory and practice. Which brings us to mistake number 2, the speaking shy away. You know when you avoid speaking practice because you're terrified of making mistakes.
Oh, absolutely. This one's a classic. But here's the thing. Everyone makes mistakes. It's part of the process.
Yeah, but it can feel so embarrassing to mess up, especially in front of native speakers.
I get it. But think of it this way. Mistakes are actually valuable learning opportunities. It's how our brains figure out what works and what doesn't.
It's like our brain is saying, whoops, wrong path. Let's try a different connection next time.
Exactly. And the source really emphasizes embracing those imperfections. The more you speak, the more fluent you'll become.
Right, so mistakes are good. Got it. But what about that feeling of utter doom when you do make a mistake? It's like this mistake mania takes over, and suddenly I feel like giving up entirely.
I know that feeling. It's like you hit a wall and suddenly all your confidence disappears.
Exactly.
But it's important to remember that mistakes are an inevitable part of the learning process. Think of a child learning to walk. They stumble and fall countless times before they can run. It's the same with language. Each mistake is an opportunity to adjust and improve.
So true. It's all part of the journey. Speaking of journeys, sometimes it feels like I'm taking the wrong path over and over again, especially when I fall into the translation trap, that classic word-for-word translation.
Oh, the translation trap, a classic pitfall. It's so tempting to rely on direct translation, but it can lead to some pretty awkward and confusing situations.
Like that time I tried to tell my German friend I was feeling blue,
Hmm.
and I ended up saying I was feeling like a Smurf. I still cringe thinking about it.
Oh, that's a good one. It's a perfect example of how direct translations don't always work. Languages have their own unique ways of expressing things.
So how do we break free from this translation trap?
The key is to start thinking in the target language. Instead of translating word for word, try to visualize the concept you want to express, and then find the corresponding words and phrases in the new language.
So think in pictures, not dictionaries.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about grammar, speaking, and translation. What about vocabulary? I feel like I'm constantly drowning in new words. It's vocabulary overload.
I hear you. Vocabulary is a huge part of language learning,
Right.
and it can definitely feel overwhelming. The source emphasizes the importance of learning vocabulary in context. Instead of memorizing endless lists, focus on words that are relevant to your life.
So instead of trying to memorize every word for kitchen utensil, I should focus on words like fork, spoon, and knife if I'm actually trying to cook something. Exactly. Start with words and phrases you can actually use. You'll be much more likely to remember them that way.
Make it practical. Okay, that makes sense. Let's move on to mistake number 6, pronunciation neglect. I know this one's super important because mispronunciation can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings.
Absolutely. The source has some good advice on this one. First, actively listen to native speakers. Pay attention to how they form sounds and try to mimic their intonation.
Podcasts, movies, music, there are so many resources out there.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Find a language partner or a tutor who can help you fine-tune your pronunciation.
It's like fine-tuning an instrument. The more you practice, the better you'll sound. Okay, so we've covered grammar, speaking, translation, vocabulary, and pronunciation. We're on a roll. But there's another mistake I think we've all fallen into. especially when we're first starting out textbook tunnel vision.
Yes, the danger of relying too heavily on textbooks.
It's like learning to speak from a robot. You might sound grammatically correct, but not very natural.
Exactly. Textbooks can be helpful for learning the basics, but they often present language in a very formal way. It's important to immerse yourself in more authentic sources of language, too, like movies, music podcasts, and real-life conversations.
So create that language bubble we talked about. Surround yourself with the sounds and rhythms of the language.
Exactly. The more you expose yourself to the language, the more natural it will become.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's all about finding ways to make the language come alive, to make it real. Not just something you study, but something you experience.
You got it. And that brings us to our final mistake for this part of the dive, the goal-setting gap. A lot of learners struggle because they haven't set clear, achievable goals for themselves.
Yeah, it's like setting out on a road trip without a map. You
No.
might enjoy the scenery, but you'll probably end up lost.
Exactly. So the source recommends starting with a big picture goal. What do you ultimately want to achieve with this language?
I love that idea. Having that big goal in mind can definitely keep you motivated. But what about breaking it down into smaller, more manageable steps?
That's a great point. Once you have your big goal, it's important to set smaller, more specific goals that will help you get there. These could be things like learning a certain number of new words each week, or having a short conversation in the target language.
It's like creating a roadmap for your language learning journey, with checkpoints along the way to mark your progress.
Exactly. And don't forget to track your progress. That can be incredibly motivating.
So whether you use a language learning app, keep a journal, or just make a simple checklist, find a way to celebrate those wins along the way.
Absolutely. Because every step forward is a step closer to your language learning goals.
Awesome. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, exploring those common mistakes that can trip us up on our language learning journeys. But we've also started to uncover how to avoid those pitfalls and set ourselves up for success.
That's right. It's all about shifting our perspective and approaching language learning with the right mindset and strategies.
So stay tuned, because in the next part, we'll delve even deeper into practical strategies for overcoming these challenges and setting yourself up for language learning success.
We'll see you soon.
All right, so in part one, we uncovered those 8 common mistakes that can trip us up when we're learning a new language. But now it's time to get practical right. Let's turn those mistakes into stepping stones.
Exactly.
I'm ready to learn some actionable tips. Where do we start?
Well, remember that speaking shy away we talked about, that fear of speaking that keeps so many learners from actually, speaking. The source really emphasizes just diving in and practicing, even if it feels uncomfortable at first.
Okay, easier said than done right. I mean, it can feel so intimidating, especially in the beginning, like stage fright, but with grammar and vocabulary thrown in for good measure.
Oh, for sure. It's a big hurdle to overcome.
So how do we get over that hurdle?
Well, think of it like learning to ride a bike. You're going to wobble, maybe even fall a few times before you find your balance. It's the same with speaking. The more you practice, the more confident and fluent you'll become.
Okay, I like that analogy. But isn't there a risk of reinforcing bad habits if you speak too early? How do you find that balance between pushing yourself and making sure you're not just practicing the wrong way?
That's a great question, and the source actually addresses that concern. One suggestion is to find a language partner or join a conversation group. This gives you a safe space to practice with others who are also learning.
Makes sense. Plus, you get feedback from more experienced speakers.
Exactly.
It's like having a built-in safety net. Oh, Pete, but what if you don't have a language partner right away?
Well, there are still plenty of ways to practice speaking on your own. You could talk to yourself, record yourself speaking, even just narrate your daily activities in the target language.
It's like giving your inner monologue a linguistic makeover.
Exactly. The key is to find opportunities to use the language in any way you can.
Love that.
Yeah.
So we've talked about getting over that fear of speaking. What about the translation trap? Any practical strategies for breaking free from that one?
Well, remember we talked about thinking in pictures, not dictionaries.
Right. Thinking in the target language, not translating word for word.
Exactly. And the source also highlights the importance of immersion, surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible.
So watching movies, listening to music, reading books, all in the language I'm learning.
Yeah, creating that language bubble we talked about.
Okay, so immersion is key.
Right.
Got it. Now, what about vocabulary overload? We talked about learning words in context. But any of the tips for making sure those new words actually stick?
One thing the source suggests is focusing on vocabulary that's relevant to your interests.
Okay, so make it personal.
Yeah, exactly. If you're a foodie, start with restaurant vocabulary. If you're into sports, learn those terms. Make the language your own.
I love that idea. It's so much more motivating to learn words you'll actually use. But what about those times when you just can't seem to remember a word? Any strategies for dealing with those brain freeze moments?
Oh, yeah, those happen to everyone. Don't get discouraged. One tip from the source is to try describing the word you're looking for. Use other words, you know.
Like playing charades with yourself.
Exactly. Even if you don't remember the exact word, you're still communicating.
Right, you're still practicing. Okay, that's a good one. So we've talked about speaking practice, immersion, vocabulary. What about pronunciation?
Oh, pronunciation is crucial.
I'm always worried about sounding like a total beginner. Or even worse, accidentally saying something offensive because I mispronounced a word.
I hear you, those are valid concerns.
They are.
But pronunciation is a skill you can improve with practice.
That's good to know.
The source recommends paying attention to the sounds of the language and how they're produced. There are tons of online resources that can help you break down the sounds.
Videos, interactive exercises.
Yeah, all sorts of things.
I also find it helpful to listen to native speakers and try to mimic their intonation.
That's a great strategy.
It's like learning a song by ear.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to record yourself speaking and listen back.
I have to admit, listening to myself speak a new language can be a little cringeworthy at first.
I know what you mean.
But it's also really helpful to hear how you sound from an outsider's perspective.
Totally agree.
Okay, so we've covered speaking practice, immersion, vocabulary, pronunciation. We're making great progress. Now, what about that goal-setting gap we discussed in part 1? How can we set ourselves up for success with clear goals?
Well, the source recommends starting with that big picture goal. What do you ultimately want to achieve with this language?
Right, but then how do we break that down into smaller steps?
Well, it could be anything that helps you move towards that big goal. Learning a certain number of new words each week, finishing a textbook chapter, watching a movie without subtitles, having a conversation on a specific topic, even just dedicating a certain amount of time to language learning each day.
Yeah, make it specific.
Exactly. The key is to make those goals smart. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Smart goals. I love that. But what about tracking our progress? Any advice from the source on that?
There are lots of ways to track your progress. You could use a language learning app, keep a journal, or just make a simple checklist.
I'm a big fan of the language learning journal. It's so satisfying to look back and see how far you've come.
Exactly. And it can help you identify areas you might need to focus on more.
Awesome. Well, we've covered a lot of practical strategies in this part of our deep dive, from finding speaking partners to immersing ourselves in the language to setting smart goals. There are so many ways to make language learning more effective and enjoyable.
Absolutely. And don't forget the most important ingredient, fun.
Right. If you're not enjoying the process, you're less likely to stick with it.
Exactly. So find what works for you, experiment, and don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Mistakes are part of the process.
They are. In the final part of this deep dive, we'll explore some additional resources and tips to help you stay motivated and keep that language learning momentum going.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so we've talked about those common language learning mistakes, and we've uncovered some really helpful strategies for overcoming them. But let's be real. Language learning, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right?
Absolutely.
So in this final part of our deep dive, I think we need to talk about motivation.
You're so right. It's natural for motivation to go up and down during any long-term project, and language learning is no different.
Yeah, we need some strategies for those days when even opening a textbook feels impossible.
I hear that.
What does the source suggest for staying motivated?
Well, one key suggestion is to make language learning part of your daily routine, even if it's just for a few minutes each day. Consistency is key.
So instead of thinking I have to study for an hour, it's more like I'll listen to a 5-minute podcast while I make coffee. Little things add up over time.
Exactly. Small steps consistently make a big difference.
But how do we make sure those small steps don't become boring? How do we keep things fresh and exciting?
Well, think of it like training for a marathon. Some days you'll be sprinting, others you'll be stretching. But the key is showing up consistently.
That's a great analogy.
Language learning is similar. Find your pace, but keep moving forward.
So find that balance between challenge and enjoyment.
Exactly.
Any other tips for injecting some fun into the process?
Well, the source suggests tapping into your interests. If you love to cook, try finding recipes in the target language or watching cooking shows from that culture.
I love that. Make it relevant to your life. What about music? I know music can be a great way to learn a language.
Absolutely. Try listening to music in the target language, singing along, or even learning some songs by heart.
And with all the streaming services out there, it's easier than ever to find movies and TV shows in almost any language.
Exactly. It's like having a window into another culture.
But all of this can feel a bit overwhelming if you're doing it alone, right?
You're right. That's why the source also emphasizes the importance of finding your tribe.
Our language learning tribe,
Exactly. Connect with other learners. Find a supportive community.
like an online forum or a local language exchange group.
Yeah, or even just a friend who's learning the same language. Sharing your struggles and successes with others can help you stay motivated.
It's amazing how much easier things can feel when you know you're not alone.
It's true.
And speaking of struggles, I think it's important to remember that mistakes are part of the process.
Absolutely. Don't let the fear of making mistakes hold you back. Every mistake is a chance to learn and grow.
And how do we celebrate those moments when we do succeed? Those times when we finally grasp a new concept or have a successful conversation.
Celebrating your progress is so important. It reinforces those positive feelings and keeps you motivated.
So even small wins deserve a celebration.
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be anything big. Treat yourself to something you enjoy. Acknowledge how far you've come.
It's all about those small victories along the way. Language learning, it's a journey, not a destination. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with this thought. It's not about achieving perfect fluency. It's about the experiences you'll have, the connections you'll make, and the new ways you'll see the world.
Beautifully said.
So keep exploring, keep practicing, and most importantly, keep having fun. We'll see you on our next deep dive.